So we've been talking about how scientists classify organisms and how they use hierarchical classification to put animals in groups by complexity or by niche or by all kinds of criteria. And they also use morphological structures and DNA analysis to actually do this. Now, nowadays, because they realize that hierarchical taxonomy had problems, they actually organize things in trees of life and follow something that's called a phylocode. In other words, a dichotomous key that helps us guide in a phylogenetic tree that gives you a more insight into the evolutionary relationships that occurred throughout the process of evolution to create the looks of the tree of life that exist today. So we're going to be talking in this video about the main taxa or groups of life forms that exist, and as we do so, we're going to talk about them taxonomically and also phylogically. So let's see if you actually follow along. Now remember, of course, there are three main domains of life. There are the ancient archaeobacteria, which are close to the first original ancestors of life. They're primitive bacteria that are similar to the ones that used to live in the first harsh environments that life was like in the early Earth. Then you have the modern bacteria that's everywhere. Some of them cause disease, which call them bacteria. And we divide these domains because of differences between them. And then there are the eukaryotic groups, and the eukaryotic cells come closer to the archaea group than to the actual modern bacterial group. And this archaea group includes the same kind of ribosomal RNA that the eukaryotic cells have, at least very similar, more similar so than the one from bacteria. But there are still DNA from bacteria inside eukaryotes, which seems to indicate the lateral DNA transfers happen early on. We'll talk more about that in a second. But remember, eukaryotic cells include protists, which are the most diverse group of eukaryotic cells, unicellular eukaryotic cells. Most of the branches of this particular tree of life that you see, the gray branches, are all the unicellular eukaryotic cells, which we call protists. And this diverse group created different kinds of advanced organisms as well, such as land plants, which came from a plant-like protist group. They also have the animal-like protist group, which gave rise to the animals, and you also have the fungus-like group, which gave rise to the fungus. And these are the three types of multicellular eukaryotic cell groups. And we're going to be talking about each one of them as we go along in this video, so I hope that you follow along. So here we go. Let's start with archaean bacteria. Now, the archaean bacteria were the first cells to evolve, or at least they're the descendants of the very first cells to evolve. They live in the early Earth, and even today they still live in the harsh environments, such as sewage treatment plants, thermal or volcanic vents, hot springs, and geysers that are acidic, and also very salty water, such as the Dead Sea or the Great Salt Lake, and they often occur as decomposers, parasites, or chemotrophs. Now remember, decomposers help complete the cycle of life, breaking down organic matter into the organic nutrients or other basic nutrients which are necessary for producers to do the job of starting the food chain. And you also have parasites, which live inside other organisms, or chemotrophs, which perform chemical reactions for cell energy purposes that have nothing to do with cellular respiration or photosynthesis, although some of them are basically the forefathers of those processes. And some examples actually include this one, the methanogens, which are actually the ones which live and produce methane gas and metabolize this in a different way, so like chemotroph. There's also something similar with sulfur, and which are called sulfur bursts, and you also have the halophytes, which are the ones that live in salty environments. You also have the thermophiles, which are the ones that live in hot environments, and you also have acidophiles, which are the ones that live in acidic environments. So this is the most ancient group, and as this you can see is a prokaryotic cell that does not even have internal organelles except for ribosomes, and a very, very simple cell at that. But even then, it's much more complex than your run-of-the-mill factory. It's very, very complex, and it's very, very small. But then you also have the EUBACTERIA. It's a little bit bigger, and some of them cause disease, and they're found everywhere except the harsh environments. Although I would say the stomach acid of intestines of animals and stomachs of animals are going to be harsh environments, but a lot of these organisms will live in those environments symbiotically with the animals, allowing them to digest things like cellulose, which a lot of animals do not. And they're going to be important for an environment because they are the main decomposers for the environment, and some of them, of course, are parasites or chemotrophs like its predecessors, the archaean bacteria. And they are actually very important commercially because we use them to make things like cottage cheese, yogurt, and buttermilk, and they're also used for environmental sequestration or modification of environments which have been poisoned by human activity, by pollution, such as rivers, lakes, or even landfills. Adding certain types of bacteria can help process these pollutants and actually try to clean them and over time. And here's a classic example of a bacteria, the E. coli bacteria, which is an enteric bacteria that lives in the intestines of animals, including humans. And this is why you have to wash your hands after you go to the bathroom, because if you do not, you're spreading them all over the place, and people don't. So remember that before, when you go to a public place that has a lot of doorknobs, all those doorknobs and things like that were touched by people who didn't wash their hands. It's actually funny because you'll find more of these in such places than you will find at the actual seat of the toilet, because that seat is cleaned more often than doorknobs and things like that are cleaned. And so try to be hygienic, otherwise these things will actually spread disease if you actually ingest them. And that's why some people get things called E. coli poisoning. Now remember that these groups constitute the first groups of life. Now the archaea group is the most ancient group that's close to the original life form. And then you have the bacteria group, which is a branch out of that. But eukaryotic cells evolved out of the archaean branch, but have DNA from bacteria cells, which indicates that lateral transfer DNA through things like organism fusion and also symbiosis and endosymbiosis, like with the mitochondria and chloroplast, as well as viral transduction and conjugation among the early life forms, led to the formation of eukaryotic cells, which have DNA from the bacteria, even though they're actually more similar to archaebacteria than to bacteria. And this is all split based on ribosomal RNA, which is the most stable type of molecular clocking mechanism. We are very close to archaeans in that sense, but very far from bacteria. And that's why we separate the groups like that. But we still have bacterial DNA inside of our cells, which indicates the fact that more than likely some lateral DNA transfer happened early on. So this is kind of how our tree of life looks like, the tree of life that we have ongoing. We have the original life form, and the derived character splits the archaebacteria, which is actually closer to the original life form, from the true bacteria, which exists today in many environments. Now, one of the major differences between them, aside from the niche that they live in different environments and act in different ways, one is more extreme than the other. You also have the fact that the true bacteria are going to be a little more complex in their structures on the cytoplasm as well as their cell wall. They have peptoglycan and extremely complex cell walls made of peptoglycan. And, of course, the ribosomal RNA is the main difference that led us to differentiate between the groups. Then you have the branch that went on to become the eukaryotic branch, and the main difference here, of course, is the derived character, of course, between the two groups is going to be the production of internal organelles, or the endomembrane system, and other organelles like mitochondria, chloroplasts, and things like that. Now, of course, that explains the lateral DNA transfer that occurred between the true bacteria branch and this branch of the tree of life, because of that endosymbiotic event and conjugation and viral transduction events. But eukaryotic cells will be organized in two main groups. You have eukaryotic cells, which have multicellular organisms, and eukaryotic cells which do not. The ones that do not are referred to as Protista, and they include protozoans, algae, and fungus-like protists. We'll talk more about them soon. You also have the fungus group, and you have the planetoid group and the animal group. Now, the last three are going to be examples of organisms which are mostly multicellular organisms, while the Protista group are unicellular organisms. And like it is with the bacteria, unicellular organisms constitute the most diverse groups of things in life. The bacteria and the EUBACTERIA are clearly much more diverse than any other group, because they have a lot of environments, a lot of niches that they live in, and they've been evolving for the last 3.5 billion years. And even though the majority of them do not do anything like sex reproduction and are limited only to lateral DNA transfers like viral transduction, organism fusion, and conjunction events, they still have a lot of genetic variety, because their mechanisms to control mutations are weaker than those of eukaryotic cells, and therefore they're going to be mutating very fast. And since they replicate very fast, they're going to go through a lot of mutations. Now, after you have eukaryotic cells, sexual reproduction also evolves, and that allows a great explosion of diversity. But the eukaryotic cells exist for less than 700 million years, while the life of archaea-like bacteria exists for 3.5 billion years. So even though sexual reproduction accelerated the evolutionary process, just the bare fact that bacteria have been evolving for longer allowed them to be a more diverse group of organisms than the eukaryotic branches of the tree of life are. But either way, after the evolution of eukaryotic cells, the split of the tree of life started to become happen faster because of such reproduction increases the variation, which allows more diversity for natural selection to work upon. So here we are in the eukaryotic groups of the cell life. We have the Protista group, which here they're not actually splitting. And then you have the other groups such as animals, fungus, sponges, and plants. Now, some protists are going to be very different from any of these groups. They're not anything like fungus, like animals, or like plants. But a majority of protists can be categorized in that sense. All right, so let's talk about protists in a little more detail. Protists are going to be mostly unicellular, although some of them live in something we call colonies. Or in other words, they can only exist in groups of animals that look the same. They're going to be colonial unicellular organisms. That means that they're not truly multicellular. They don't have differentiated groups of cells performing different functions. They have cells which all look the same performing different functions. So it's basically the same cell many times. So they're clones that live together. Classic example of that are going to be things like algae and things like diatoms and other things like that. But the majority of them are going to be occupying two main roles. They're either going to be autotrophic or heterotrophic. The autotrophic ones are the ones we call plant-like, and then the heterotrophic ones are the ones that we call animal or fungus-like. Now, the majority of them are again going to be aquatic organisms that require water to survive. Some examples of these include the protozoans, which are the animal-like heterotrophs. They have no cell walls or chloroplasts, but they do have mitochondria inside of them and internal organelles. And these includes things like euglena, like paramecium, and others, amoeba, and other cells like that. Now, euglenas, funnily enough, actually have chloroplasts inside of them, even though they act like heterotrophs most of the time. Now, algae is a plant-like protozoan that actually makes its own food, and for many people they actually group some groups of algae as early plants, and so that's another example of why we actually use phylogenetic trees instead of taxonomy, because it just makes more sense since the plants clearly came from algae. But they all have cell walls and made of things which are similar or even are cellulose just like the plants, and they have chloroplasts just like the plants. But there are some groups of protozoans which are plant-like, which have other plastids other than chloroplasts. Chloroplast is not the only version of photosynthetic plastids found inside of cells. There are some other ones. And there's also fungus-like protists like molds or water modes, which are external heterotrophs. And we'll talk more about what that means when we talk about fungus. But yeah, I wanted to remind you that there are also fungus-like protists. So let's go back here again on our trees of life. So if you have the protists, protists are a majority of them are going to be organisms which are not necessarily part of the animal branches or anything like that. But some protists are going to be fungus-like, some protists are going to be plant-like, and some protists are going to be animal-like. So the protists around this branch are going to be plant-like, the protists around these branches here are going to be animal-like, and the protists around this branch are going to be fungus-like before you get to the actual fungus. So let's finish this video reviewing the unicellular microscopic life that exists on Earth. The most ancient type is going to be the archaeobacteria, or descendants of which now today are called archaeobacteria. Then you have the advancement on that, which is the true bacteria, but we are actually closer to the archaen than to the true bacteria, although lateral DNA transfer from true bacteria must have occurred early in the tree of life, which is why we call it the ring of life. We also have evolution of eukaryotic cells, and the first ones are going to be the protists, and some do not actually fit any of these criteria, but the majority of them are going to be either animal-like, fungus-like, or plant-like. Although there are cross groups like the euglena, which live heterotrophic lives but have chloroplasts inside of them, so they can also perform autotrophic events. Either way, we're going to learn more about every one of these groups as we talked about them in the remainder of the year. But on the next video, we're going to discuss the multicellular eukaryotic life. I'll see you guys then.